In the small town of Heston, Indiana, there is a railway-focused museum with two different track gauges, miniature gauge and narrow gauge, that runs in a loop around a nice-looking forest with a creek and stuff. Being relatively nearby to our home, when I was really young, when I really liked trains, my mom took me there quite a bit, and we have a few old photos, but unfortunately they're all stored away on Mom's old PC, which is currently not working. The oldest photos I have was from a September 2021 trip, specifically on September 6th. I don't have very many photos of this trip because this is before I got into filming trains, so yeah, there's not very many. All the ones I have are either pictures of me and my family, which I don't really want to show for reasons, and the rest of them are pictures from riding the train. One significant outlier, though, is the pictures that we got during the tractor parade. Heston seemingly isn't doing these tractor parades anymore, so unfortunately I think this is going to be the last one I ever get the chance to take photos of. None of these photos were taken by me, they were all taken by my mom, and you can see me in the foreground here. Now we jump ahead a couple months to May 28th, 2022. This was after I got into filming trains, so I was excited to come and, well, film the trains. I mean, what else would I be doing? Here's the sign at the entrance to Hesstons. I rushed in as quickly as possible and caught the small train, Set Inquiry Central 1, pulling into the station. Hesstons was running 3 trains on the day of my visit: the narrow gauge engine, Heston and Galena Creek number 2, the miniature gauge engine, Set Inquiry Central number 1, and the model/G gauge engine, a replica of Norfolk Southern 8102, the Pennsylvania Railroad Heritage Unit. Behind the trains is this British-looking steamroller. Number 2 was putting on quite a show with all of its smoke. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a shot of the train leaving because my mom convinced me to ride the train instead. Here, you can see number 2 pulling on the curve outside of the main station.
Keep your hands in the go! I don't know what the hell to do.
We are going to journey for the next 20 minutes.
The engine propelling the train here is Heston and Galena Creek number 2, built in 1911 by Porter. It was used in Guatemala for the entirety of its service lives before being sold back to the US for tourist purposes. It eventually ended up at the Heston Steam Museum. It had a hefty overhaul recently, so the engine is in great shape for pulling these excursions. This line was opened in 1968 and is a significantly windy and steeply graded section of the museum. It almost crosses the border into Michigan. Honestly, I think it would have been cool if it did cross the border into Michigan. While we were riding through this cutting, the train headed up the steepest gradient on the line. And then this happened.
We're going backwards! Guys, we need to go full speed ahead! We're going to be going full speed ahead! Everybody
We're
come
going to try
on!
to climb the hill again. We need a little bit of,
Yeah, we need to...
Number 2 lost its grip on the rails, which caused panic to erupt through the entire crowd. Of course, I didn't panic. I knew they were only driving the engine down the hill so they could get another good run at it. Well, they tried at least.
Okay, I'm gonna do this the whole time. Oh, God, yeah, we're going back to the station to take off. Oh, guys, hang on! On the Michigan.
Despite its struggle up the hill, number 2 eventually did complete its round trip, and we got off. We were going to catch number 2 departing, but Mom convinced me to ride the train again, and I hopped on the small train pulled by Norfolk Southern 8102. Unfortunately, the only seats available were ones near the front of the train, and I didn't want to film from the front of the train because I knew I wouldn't be able to get much of the locomotive in the shot. Thankfully, Mom filmed for me, but unfortunately, the cars are super small, so you can pretty much only see the passengers ahead of us, and that's pretty much it. But I can give you a tour of what the line looks like. Here, we're passing by the locomotive shops used to maintain the miniature gauge locomotives. As you can see, the person in front of us is just as adamant about filming as we were. Here you can see the train pass a whistle sign. All the whistle signs on the narrow gauge lines and also on the miniature gauge lines are stylized to look like the Pennsylvania Railroad's Keystone logo. Here you can see the dual gauge 2 and 3 foot line that number 2 runs on. It's interesting because number 2 runs on the 3 foot gauge track while the coaches run on the 2 foot gauge. Here you can see I'm passing a campground sign and a random traffic cone. Wonder who left that there. Now we can see a tree with a face on it. Oh, looks like it's missing one of its eyes. Hopefully I can get that back eventually. Here, we approach the first of many bridges along the route. You can just catch a glimpse of the front of the Gevo as we round the bend. This bridge only has a guardrail on one side because there's only water on one side. You can also see the 2 and 3 foot gauge track snake away into the forest while the miniature gauge takes a different route. Now the train is approaching Cinder Point, as evidenced by the sign. Again, you can see the front of the cab of the Gevo as we round the bend. This locomotive is not owned by Hesstons. It's a hobby locomotive that was constructed by the driver of it, which you can see a little bit in these shots, by himself, and then it was brought to Heston's for the exhibition. You can also see a switch in the track, which is also stylized after the Keystone logo. Now we approach the second bridge. There's a sign next to it that says Hanson's Gulch. Is that the name of the bridge, or is it the name of the river that the bridge passes over? I'm not sure, but it also says Billwend on the top. Here we pass by a set that says Hobo's Suppy. I'm guessing it's supposed to say supply, they just spelled it wrong. Maybe they spelled it wrong on purpose. Ooh, who knows? Now we pass under a bridge marked as Elaine, as well as going over a smaller bridge. We'll pass over the Elaine Bridge later in the trip. I've always thought it looked more like a model railway bridge than an actual bridge. And the train is now also meeting back up with the 2 and 3 foot gauge track. Soon enough, even though the train has slowed down to a crawl, we're approaching one of the strange bridge/shed/protection/shelter things. I'm not sure what to call it, but it's definitely a bridge. I don't know what these are for, but they are cool. This crosses the creek again. The Gevo gains a little speed heading down this gradient.
There's an iguana. Good looking. Good looking. I think he's long. long way from home.
Now we pass by a tiny little house in the woods, which I only noticed on this footage on this most recent rewatch. Now the train winds around a gradual S-bend as we approach the Elaine Bridge once again. As you can see, my brother puts his hands on top of the bridge and my mom yells at him to stop.
Keep your hands inside. Yeah, we went under it, now we're going over it.
Now we pass underneath another one of those weird shelter bridge hybrids, except this one doesn't seem to be going over any river. There looks to be a little sign for a name up there, but there's nothing on it. Now we pass by what I think is the only non-Keystone logo whistle sign on the route. It doesn't seem to apply to this line though, as the engineer doesn't honk his horn when he passes by. I'm not sure why, but Mom stopped filming once we approached the lake. Too bad, because this is the best looking part of Hesstons. After that, we headed on a tour of the locomotive shops. Thankfully, they're open to visitors. This is Flying Dutchman Railroad number 15. It's a diesel. It's not being used currently. This is 080-99-3364. It used to work in East Germany before it was brought to Hesstons as surplus. This train is apparently named Granny, and it's the number 1 of the Brookfield Zoo before it switched to non-steam power. For some reason, it's lettered for Milwaukee Road. This is a doppelganger of number 2. It's the same class, but it doesn't look to be in too good a shape. And here's the main engine, Oregon Lumber Company Shea number 7. Man, I would have loved to see this thing in steam, but unfortunately I didn't see it on steam on this trip. While waiting for number 2 to depart, I caught 8102 leaving its station. I really wish I could have gotten a close-up shot, but hey, things happen. Hey look, Conrail flat cars. I know they're not actually Conrail flat cars, Conrail never operated narrow gauge, but it is cool to see. Then, number 1 tried to depart, but then it stopped. As you can see here, the crew member gets out, pulls out a bar from underneath the trailing truck of the engine, and now it's finally ready to leave. This was the shot I had been waiting for. Behind the engine is a string of open-air coaches, Melrose Park, Kensington, River Forest, an unnamed New York Central open wagon, and Oak Park. Then, just like clockwork, number 2 departed, with some insanely cool wheel slip. Knowing that now that both trains had departed, since this was a loop, they had to be coming back. I rushed into the station to get a shot of Set Inquiry Central number 1, and unfortunately it had to be in the shade. It was still a decent shot. Just as we had settled down, we heard the rumble of number 2. It raced past the sheds at the back and then around the bend. Then it raced into the platform. As you can see, I'm on board the miniature gauge train.
Hey, Danny LaRusso. Danny LaRusso, stop it. No fighting on my train.
Just look at number 2 in that sunlight. Doesn't it look great? As you saw earlier, I was on board Set Inquiry Central 1. This was right before Hesstons was about to close. And thankfully, and I'm very grateful for this, the crew decided to run an extra trip that they wouldn't have normally just because we wanted to ride. So this film here is dedicated to the amazing crews at Hesstons who let me ride on the train. I've got to say, number 1 is probably my favorite engine at Hesstons. I don't know why, but it reminds me of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy's S4 Hesstons, which I have a personal connection to because I saw this one, number 3007, at the Illinois Railway Museum that same summer. Heston seems to really like their weird over-the-track shelters because this line had one too. Just like number 2's service, Set Inquiry Central's 1's service runs through a grassy field. This is, I think, the farthest extent that the trains go from the main station. Set Inquiry Central 1 has an interesting history because we don't know its history. All we know is that it was eventually acquired by Hesstons and it was built in the 70s for a small railway in someone's backyard. But besides that, its history is completely unknown. The miniature gauge line that number 1 runs on was also built in 1968 as part of the 1967 Heston's expansion project to create a railway powered by steam on the property. Number 1 gets up to some pretty high speeds as it passes by the parking lot at Heston. The train has to go fast here to avoid blocking traffic for too long. And now the train has returned to its normal speed as it pulls into the station. This was a very fun train trip. As I mentioned, Hesstons was getting close to closing time. Number 2 was scheduled for one more round trip, but we decided to leave as it would be 45 minutes before number 2 would depart. On our way out, we went and snapped a picture of this little Bo Whitcomb switcher and this preserved South Shoreline caboose number 345. Oh. Now we jump ahead in time again to July 2nd, 2022, a month later. When we arrived this time, the Kittyland Limited, another 464 Hudson, this time a streamlined one, named Challenger and also Harold E. Wager Jr., both, somehow, was pulling the miniature gauge train. The passenger coach consist is the same as last time with the addition of an extra end car. Just as it had done last time, number 2 pulled out only a few minutes after the miniature gauge train had left. This shot is cool because you can see both the small depot and the main one. Now we can get a look at the 3 open-air passenger coaches. They're painted red, and as previously mentioned, they ride on the 2-foot gauge track rather than the 3-foot gauge track. Maintaining that one rail they both use must be quite a nightmare. Repeating last time again, I headed down to the depot so I could catch the miniature train coming in once again. Of course, this time it was powered by the Challenger locomotive. Now we can get a good look at the end coach at the rear of the train. As you've probably seen, these 2 trips were very similar. Once again, we heard number 2 rumbling in the distance and caught this pretty bad, if I'm honest, shot of it heading through the trees past the locomotive shops. Then it rounded the corner and headed to us. We were about to ride the miniature gauge train once again. I gotta say, I really like the Kittyland Limited. It gives me Chicago Northwestern vibes. Maybe because it has a massive C&W logo on the front of the Skyline casing. But that's just me. We rode on the narrow gauge and miniature gauge trains. I wasn't planning to film the trips for either of them, but when the narrow gauge train met up with the tiny Pennsylvania Railroad Heritage Unit pulled train, I had to film the race. Unfortunately, number 2 lost.
Narrow gauge can run again anywhere between 3 foot on down to 2 foot. We happen to have 2 tracks, as I mentioned. On your right is one of our Craftsman trains. That's running on a 7.5-inch distance between rails. The Craftsman trains are predominantly.
Now we stop by at Flying Dutchman Railroad 15 for another quick picture. And then we take a look at this little Steinman's Lumber Company Climax in the small depot. And here's number 2 and the Kittyland Limited next to each other, with the Hesstons Depot in the background. And then, luckily for me, the Pennsylvania Railroad Heritage Unit departed, making for this shot. And with one more quick picture of the two steam engines next to each other, I decided to call it a day. I would return to Heston's one more time in 2022 for the September 4th through the 5th Labor Day Steam and Power Show, but this video is already getting extremely long, so that's going to be in a separate video. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this little documentary, and make sure to come back next time for another documentary just like this one.